Japan's prime minister becomes the first foreign leader to be hosted at the White House since Biden took office. At the top of the agenda, Beijing's growing aggression. Hong Kong is sending some of its most influential pro-democracy figures to prison. The city that was once semi-autonomous now faces Beijing's crackdown on its remaining dissidents. An official document, which appeared to be Taiwan's presidential name stamp, was found to be fake. The island is accusing Beijing of trying to tear apart Taiwanese society. A loophole in a U.S. telecom ban. The head of the U.S. media regulator says there's a gap in the rules on Chinese tech giant Huawei, and it's allowed some U.S. network carriers to keep using the company's gear. And 20 million so-called volunteers aid the Chinese Communist Party in a digital public opinion war. The average age of the helpers is just 19, and some may not be who they say they are. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Japanese Prime Minister Suga on Friday became the first foreign leader to be hosted at the White House since President Biden took office. And at the top of the meeting's agenda, countering the Chinese Communist regime's growing aggression. NTD's Melina Weisskopf has more.
Japanese Prime Minister Suga joined back-to-back meetings today at the White House. He's the first foreign leader to meet in person with Biden and Harris since they took office. This meeting today really shows that it's a top priority for the two world leaders to work on strengthening their partnership, especially when it comes to combating threats from the Chinese Communist Party.
The Japan-U.S. alliance needs to be strong. This is an alliance that is connected by universal values such as freedom, democracy, and the rule of law.
They aim to work together to push back against China's recent aggressive advances in the East, the South China Seas, and the Taiwan Strait.
We committed to working together to take on the challenges from China and on issues like the East China Sea, the South China Sea, as well as North Korea, to ensure a future of a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Right now, Japan hosts over 50,000 U.S. military personnel, and they're likely to act if China tries to invade Taiwan.
We agreed to oppose any attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion in the East and South China Seas and intimidation of others in the region. At the same time, we agreed on the necessity for each of us to engage in frank dialogue with China and, in so doing, to pursue stability of international relations while upholding universal values.
Biden and Suga are also condemning the CCP's human rights abuses in Hong Kong and Xinjiang.
And we're committed to defending and advancing our shared values, including human rights and the rule of law.
5G is a top priority too. Japan is committing $2 billion to work with the U.S. to develop 5G alternatives to lessen China's Huawei dominance.
That includes making sure we invest in and protect the technologies that will maintain and sharpen our competitive edge. And those technologies are governed by shared democratic norms that we both share. Norms set by democracies, not by autocracies.
The U.S. and Japan will also work to diversify supply chains to reduce dependence on China. Their plans to strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance were met with threats from the CCP just ahead of today's meeting.
Avoid words and actions that interfere with China's internal affairs and harm China's interests, and refrain from engaging in forming cliques against China. China will make necessary responses as appropriate.
An advisor to Prime Minister Suga described today's meeting with Biden as a precursor to a series of meetings with like-minded countries to send the right message to Beijing. Another topic of conversation today was how the U.S. and Japan will work on aligning their strategies when it comes to how to handle North Korea and their nuclear missiles programs. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
Hong Kong is sending some of the most influential pro-democracy figures to prison. The city that was once semi-autonomous is now facing Beijing's crackdown. NTD's Penny Zhou has the latest.
Some of Hong Kong's most prominent pro-democracy figures are going to prison. On Friday, the city's father of democracy, Martin Lee, was sentenced to a suspended 11 months in jail. 7 former opposition lawmakers will also be jailed from 8 to 18 months. The reason for their imprisonment? They participated in 2 pro-democracy protests in 2019. Defense lawyers argued that the assemblies in question are peaceful, and their clients have long been against violence. The heaviest sentence went to activist and former lawmaker Lee Chak-yan, who will spend 18 months behind bars. He thanked supporters before going into the court.
No matter whether we are in jail or outside, we work together. So I want to thank you, all the people of Hong Kong, for the comradeship, the feeling of solidarity together. And with this feeling of solidarity, we can win.
Hong Kong's media tycoon Jimmy Lai, who is already in detention, was sentenced to a year in prison. The 73-year-old founder of Apple Daily is a fierce critic of Beijing and previously said he would not escape Hong Kong.
I cannot do that. If I leave, not only I disgrace myself, I discredit Apple Daily and also undermine the solidarity of the democratic movement. It's something I have to take responsibility.
73-year-old Margaret Ng was also sentenced. She served as an opposition lawmaker for 18 years. The Hong Kong court argued that the sentence terms will prevent similar protests from happening. The sentencing drew immense media and public attention. Envoys from the United States, European Union, Germany, Canada, France, Netherlands, and Sweden attended the hearing.
We're following this because, as I say, it involves pro-democracy figures and also it involves a peaceful protest. So clearly this is of interest, a legitimate interest to the international community, and that's why we're here today.
The sentencing came after Beijing implemented a law in Hong Kong that criminalizes criticism against Chinese and Hong Kong authorities. Earlier this month, Beijing changed the city's electoral rules to ensure only those loyal to Beijing can be in power. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
After sentencing Hong Kong lawmakers, the regime's next target seems to be local pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily. On Thursday, Hong Kong Police Chief Chris Tang said that Apple Daily continues to produce misleading reports, adding that its goal is to incite hatred and divide public opinion in Hong Kong. But Hong Kong's Journalists Association said Tang's remarks are baseless. Lots of evidence has surfaced showing police have violently attacked reporters on the street. The organization advised Tang to take back the remarks. Tang isn't the only one taking shots at pro-democracy media. A local official also joined in recently. John Lee serves as head of Hong Kong's security department. He said the city's human rights activists use the media to spread destructive thoughts. He also accused the activists of endangering national security. The remarks coincide with an editorial published by a local pro-Beijing newspaper. On Friday, Da Gongbao newspaper suggested that Apple Daily should be shut down to close a security loophole. The article accused the pro-democracy publication of colluding with foreign forces, inciting violence, and publishing fake news. Apple Daily's founder Jimmy Lai responded to the attacks. The 73-year-old's handwritten letter reads, "Let's stand tall in fallen times." He said journalists should seek justice, and as long as their minds are righteous, they are fulfilling their responsibility. Lai has been held in custody since late last year. He wrote the letter while in jail. In it, he thanked colleagues for their love and support. Lai was sentenced to an additional 12 months in prison on Friday. Hong Kong's human rights situation is getting worse. Members of a spiritual group in the U.S. are calling for attention on the escalating suppression there. NTD's Juliet Song has the details.
Around 100 Falun Gong practitioners rallied in front of the Chinese consulate in Los Angeles this Monday. They're here for one reason: to draw attention to what they see as Beijing's escalating suppression of their beliefs in Hong Kong. As Beijing tightens its grip on the city, Falun Gong practitioners are in a tricky situation. The spiritual group has been brutally persecuted in mainland China for the past 2 decades. But the group found refuge in Hong Kong when the city still enjoyed some freedom and democracy. Falun Gong is a meditation practice based on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. it became immensely popular in China in the 90s, with over 70 million people practicing it. But the regime launched a nationwide persecution campaign against the practice in 1999, aiming to destroy it. Since then, millions have been detained and tortured. At least 4,000 have been killed. Overseas Falun Gong practitioners have been trying to put an end to the persecution. In Hong Kong, they've set up information booths and passed out flyers to raise awareness about the human rights abuses. But recently, masked men have been seen vandalizing the booths.
Why?
In one area, offenders sprayed paint on signs and shredded banners. In other places, perpetrators tore down information boards. They also pushed a Falun Gong practitioner to the ground. Members of the spiritual group suspect the men are tied to the Chinese Communist Party, as the pro-Beijing group has been harassing them at the information booths for years.
This behavior is a violation of human rights and an insult to us Falun Gong practitioners. I'm very angry about it, and I'm here to protest against it.
For Pauline Ye, it's especially painful to see Hong Kong lose its freedom. She lives in Los Angeles right now, but is originally from Hong Kong.
Hong Kong used to be a very nice place, and we weren't willing to leave.
Hong Kong used to be a British colony. The UK handed over to Chinese control in 1997. At the time, the Chinese regime promised it would grant the city 50 years of freedom. Ye said at the time she thought the regime would keep its word.
We thought we could go back more often, develop our careers, or do some business there.
But in just a little over 2 decades, the Chinese regime started cracking down. It overhauled the city's election system and pushed a bill that depletes freedom of speech. The U.S. State Department has since affirmed that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous. Ye and other rally-goers hope the event can attract more attention to human rights in Hong Kong and help keep the last bit of freedom that's left there. Juliet Song, NTD News.
Beijing's top representative in Hong Kong is sending a warning message to the international community. This as he kicks off a so-called Education Day for Hong Kong's national security law. Libby Hogan reports.
Beijing's top representative in Hong Kong warned foreign powers on Thursday not to use the city as a pawn. Lui Huning made the comments at a ceremony to mark an Education Day for the national security law. Authorities organised the event, attended by Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam, to promote the sweeping new legislation China imposed last year.
Hong Kong citizens also have the shared obligation to safeguard national security sovereignty, to unite and uphold our territorial integrity, just like Chinese citizens across our entire country.
In February, Hong Kong unveiled national security education guidelines. They include teaching students as young as 6 about colluding with foreign forces, terrorism, secession and subversion, the 4 main crimes in the new law. The law has drawn sharp criticism from the West for curbing rights and freedoms in the former British colony. In the background of the event, a small protest was staged near the venue of the ceremony. 4 activists marched shouting slogans calling the law a weapon of mass destruction. Meanwhile, supporters of the law say it has restored order following mass anti-government and anti-China protests in 2019.
Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam said on Thursday, to truly achieve national security, governing power must be firmly held in the hands of patriots. The so-called patriots in this case refer to people aligned with the CCP's policies and ideology. On the same day, the pro-democracy camp responded to Beijing's recent move in Hong Kong, saying no democracy and human rights, no national security. A new development emerges in Beijing's aggression towards Taiwan. A document is circulating online that appears to feature Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen's official name stamp. It claims the island will dispose of nuclear wastewater from Japan by dumping it into a Taiwanese lake. It also accuses Tsai of treating the lives of ordinary people as child's play. But this document turned out to be a fake. President Tsai Ing-wen is blaming the falsified claim on the Chinese regime, calling it a form of cognitive warfare. She responded in a Facebook post, writing, "I would like to emphasize that democracy and freedom are hard to come by. We mustn't allow cognitive warfare to tear apart Taiwanese society." The fake document was first published on Twitter. A number of mistakes indicate it's not official information, the most obvious being the date. The document was posted online one day earlier than its date stamp. Netizens took note, mocking the discovery and sarcastically calling it a fake document from the future. A simplified Chinese character can also be spotted in the document, the form of written Chinese characters used in mainland China, but Taiwan only uses traditional Chinese characters. On top of that, some terms and grammar used in the document don't match up with standard Taiwanese documents. Officials from Taiwan's National Security Bureau say Beijing's intent is to send Taiwanese society spiraling into chaos. Beijing is using a peculiar strategy to assert territorial claims in the South China Sea. That is, to have civilians with military training occupy its claimed territories. Recently, the Chinese regime sent hundreds of vessels into the Philippines' territorial waters. This is an apparent move to profess claims in the region. The Philippine side says the Chinese ships are manned with militia and has repeatedly urged the ships to leave. But Beijing seems to be unmoved. They say the vessels are simply fishing boats. Forcibly confronting these Chinese ships could be tricky. That's because the Chinese regime claims they are not military vessels. Beijing can claim that any action against them is the same as an attack on Chinese civilians. A military review journal produced by two researchers at Johns Hopkins University and Columbia University says the advantage of Beijing's maritime strategy is its deniability. The strategy allows Chinese vessels to harass foreign civilians and warships, while allowing Beijing to deny affiliations with these actions. Coming up, a loophole in a U.S. telecom ban. The head of the Federal Communication Commission says there's a gap in the ban on Chinese tech giant Huawei, and it's allowed some U.S. network carriers to keep using the company's gear. More on that after the break.
Trends may be fleeting, but values are timeless. We now bring you this new clothing brand with classic design and luxurious comfort. It's our way of sharing hope and inspiration from the world of Shenyun. We bring you Shenyun Dancer. Wear it with honor.
Despite a ban last year, some U.S. network carriers are still using equipment from Chinese telecom giant Huawei. The head of the Federal Communication Commission says that's because of a loophole.
U.S. carriers can still purchase and use equipment from Chinese telecom companies Huawei and ZTE using private money. This despite the Federal Communication Commission or FCC's ban on purchases using federal funds.
To me, that is a glaring loophole that makes no sense.
FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr tells the Epoch Times American thought leaders Americans have come to understand the national security threat posed by China-based telecom companies. But he adds that some U.S. networks are still using these companies' equipment. Carr believes these Chinese technology firms might be able to spy on Americans.
Under China law, these companies basically have to fork over any information or data that the Communist Party might be seeking.
Carr says the FCC has evidence that a CCP-controlled carrier rerouted U.S. internet traffic from California to Washington, D.C. through a major city in South China.
You don't need to be a network engineer to understand that the California to Guangzhou to Washington, D.C. route is not the most efficient way you would route traffic if what you cared about was simply delivering the data in an efficient manner.
Chinese state-owned company China Telecom has diverted overseas internet traffic through China multiple times. This raised concerns that the communist regime might have gained access to it. The FCC is trying to replace Huawei's and ZTE's network gear already installed in the U.S. Last December, Congress gave FCC $1.9 billion to remove such equipment.
Ahead of a match with a Chinese opponent, a professional fighter says it's better dead than red. Red referring to communism. The UFC fighter's community stems partly from her family history. Her great-grandfather was killed by Soviets. NTD's Don Ma has more.
Ultimate Fighting Championship, or UFC, fighter Rose Namajunas is in the limelight. She's getting attention over her anti-communism comments, which she made before a match with a Chinese opponent.
Watching that, it was just a huge reminder of like, yeah, it's better dead than red, you know? And
the expression was coined during the Cold War era, and red refers to communism. Her remarks stem in part from her background. Namajunas' family was originally from Lithuania when it was occupied by the Soviet Union. At the time, her great-grandfather was killed by Soviets. Eventually, her family escaped the Communist Republic and fled to America. She made the remark ahead of her upcoming match with Chinese UFC fighter Zhang Weili. Zhang was born in China's Hebei province and is the first ever Chinese fighter in UFC history. She also became Communist China's first and only UFC champion in 2019. Asked by a reporter whether she regrets saying the phrase, Namajunas says she doesn't.
With communism, like from what I know, is that you can't freely have an opinion. You can't criticize your government. I can talk about
Namajunas' fight with Zhang is set for April 24th. She says her comment wasn't personal. Both Zhang and Namajunas have said that they want to become friends after the fight. The UFC currently has a $13 million facility operating in China. It's called the Shanghai Performance Institute. In September last year, the institute signed a deal with China's Olympic Committee. Under the agreement, it would become an athlete training center for this year's Tokyo Olympics and next year's Beijing Olympics. In February, UFC also signed a distribution deal with a subsidiary of Chinese telecom giant China Mobile. The partnership is valued at tens of millions of dollars. Don Ma, NTD News.
2 more U.S. universities are joining a growing number of schools that are shutting down their Confucius institutes. The 2 colleges are the University of Southern Maine, or USM, and the University of New Hampshire, or UNH. USM's public affairs director says its Confucius Institute had too few students to be sustainable. The program will end on June 10th. Senator Susan Collins from Maine says she welcomes the decision. At the same time, the University of New Hampshire is following suit. UNH's Confucius Institute will close on July 30th due to growing concerns in Washington about security and influence. The school spokesperson says UNH might lose significant federal research funding if it keeps its Confucius Institute on campus. UNH has partnered with the institute since 2010. The National Association of Scholars says about 50 Confucius Institutes are operating in the U.S., including 8 that are set to close. Since 2019, multiple universities have shut down their Confucius Institutes. They include Arizona State University, Indiana University, the University of South Florida, the University of Michigan, and the University of North Florida. Another U.S. college, Tufts University, will also close its Confucius Institute this September. A university near Karl Marx's birthplace is suspending all activities tied to Beijing's Confucius Institutes. The German university is located in the city of Trier. The BBC says about 150,000 Chinese tourists visit Marx's hometown every year, more than any other German tourist destination. But Trier University has decided to stay away from China's Confucius Institutes. Beijing advertises the program as a language and cultural exchange, linking Chinese schools and universities to those overseas. But critics label the program as a tool exporting Beijing's influence and communist theory. Confucius Institutes worldwide are also funded by one of the Chinese regime's agencies and are tied to China's top foreign influence department. In a recent statement dated March 29th, Trier University says its goal is to protest against Beijing's sanctions on scholars. In March, Beijing announced sanctions on a number of European agencies and individuals. The move was apparent retaliation for those speaking out against China's human rights abuses, mainly against the Uyghur ethnic minority in Xinjiang. The penalties immediately followed EU sanctions on Chinese officials responsible for torturing Uyghurs. German think tank the Mercator Institute for China Studies is one of 4 European organizations on the Chinese Communist Party's blacklist. But China's targeting of German academics hasn't sat well with Trier University. Following Trier's lead, other German universities in Dortmund and Hamburg are also distancing themselves from Confucius institutes. Doris Liu is the director of a film focused on Confucius institutes. She told the Epoch Times that the move marks a trend and that countries around the world are scrapping the program. She described the institutes as far more than language or cultural programs and accused some faculty members of spying for Beijing. 20 Confucius institutes currently operate in German colleges and universities. The CCP's public opinion war involves a lot more participants than you may have imagined. In addition to the 50-cent army, 20 million so-called volunteers have also joined the fight. Their average age is just 19. The 50-cent army refers to internet commentators hired by Chinese authorities. Their job is to manipulate public opinions online. Their name comes from their alleged pay of 50 cents per post. Earlier this week, Georgetown University researcher Ryan Fedusiak published his study about China's internet trolls at a Washington-based think tank. Fedusiak says according to research data, most of the so-called online volunteers are college students. Their task is to, as they call it, purify the cyberspace. The report says these volunteers need to like, forward, and comment on Chinese social media to support the CCP's narratives and policies. They also need to attack, censor, or ban anyone criticizing the regime. Their official name is online propagandists. As early as 2014, a notice from the Central Office of the Communist Youth League demanded that colleges vigorously build a team of online propagandists. A list attached to the notice shows the number of online propagandists at different Chinese universities. The top school on the list has 1,200 of them. Fedusiak also points out many of these college students are not necessarily volunteers. Some of them may want to work in government agencies or state-run companies after graduation. Experiences as an online propagandist can make their resumes look better. Fedusiak reminds the international community about the CCP's recent boycott of international brands. He says this is just the first step of the CCP's public opinion war. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you next time.